Now, unfortunately, I'm going to have to talk to you about former Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, because in news that should surprise no one, he is a liar. He lied to our faces constantly during those painful, lengthy press conferences where he claimed that he was imposing the world's toughest lockdown restrictions due to medical advice.
There will be a curfew on advice from the Chief Health Officer from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. each and every day. That comes into effect from tonight. I'm asking people to curfew from 9 p.m. The rules don't kick in until midnight, but I'm asking people to observe that curfew from 9 p.m. tonight. From 11:59 p.m. this evening, all of these changes will become effective. The curfew, obviously, because it's at 9 p.m, we'd ask people to observe that from 9 p.m, even though it doesn't come into legal effect until just before midnight tonight. That is on direct advice from the Chief Health Officer, and he'll be the next to speak, and he can explain to you why he's provided that advice and more.
Yeah, what a hero. I mean, locking Victorians in their homes, destroying businesses, plunging the state into debt, sparking really a dark and very real mental health crisis in Victoria. And it's now been revealed that the decision to force millions of people to live under a curfew was not based on health advice. Documents obtained by the Herald Sun reveal that the curfew was proposed without any formal input from health authorities. So Dan Andrews, he has the nickname as Dictator Dan, and that couldn't be more true. Adam, you're in Melbourne. How are Melburnians feeling now this truth has finally come out? A truth I think we all suspected, and it has been revealed.
Well, look, fortunately, I was in the US during the worst of that lockdown in Victoria, and I've been living here for the last few months, and I think people are really scarred by the experience. Kind of when they do talk about it, I think they're ashamed. It's a mix of shame and embarrassment about what happened, and I think this is, this just really worsens the wound, this new story that's come out that suggests, as I expected at the time, I was writing about it for America, writing about it from afar, but, the idea, the health advice said to lock down people in general, let alone between specific hours of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m, was always complete nonsense. It was just there because certain politicians enjoyed the sick exercise of power. I think that's all it was. It was all about politics. It wasn't about health science. It was about political science. And the devastation, I mean, as a result, it's just extraordinary. I mean, I hope people never forget what Victoria went through with the quarantines and the shutdown of certain apartment blocks, the destruction of people's human rights for hundreds and hundreds of days, and their death outcomes were worse than any other state. So what does that say about the effectiveness of lockdowns? I mean, it was a shameful episode in Australian history, and the Western world more generally, I would say, but particularly Victoria. There was no health advice. There was no pandemic plan that had been written in any Western country ever that suggested to lock a population down because of a virus ever. And yet we did it, and we did it because we wanted to copy communist China. I don't want to rant about this, it's one of my pet topics, but it's just, it just made me angry listening to that press conference of him lying back. I assume that was 2021. I mean, the height of the man. And well, I think there's been other reports that he doesn't like going outside now in Victoria, and that probably goes to the fact that he gets screamed at quite occasionally.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember living in Melbourne through the horrific COVID period, attending many of those press conferences. And I tell you what, the anger was very much alive then. I remember going to press conferences that were rarely held outside, but I went to a couple that were, and there were people heckling and shouting, and there's so much anger. And of course, there would be when he was putting Melburnians through, such horrific circumstances, things that people shouldn't have to live through, taking away so many freedoms. But over in the US, Donald Trump is not going to let Americans forget about the lies that we were all told during the COVID pandemic. The Trump administration has overhauled the official covid.gov website into a website that reads lab leak, displaying evidence that COVID came from a lab in Wuhan, China. And the website also names Anthony Fauci as a person who wanted to cover this up. And it points out how damaging lockdowns were to not only the economy, but the mental and physical health of Americans. Now, this, of course, would have been better 5 years ago, but I love that Trump has done this. It is an important reminder that we should not forget what we all went through 5 years ago, and it's important that it's out there.
No, look, it really is. And just to what we were discussing earlier, I mean, with the lockdowns in general, if you look at the US, it was states like Florida and Texas that did the least, and states like California and New York that did the most in terms of lockdowns, but their death outcomes are actually the same. So these extremely destructive policies were not effective, and yet they are extremely socially and economically damaging. The same is true in Europe. If you look at Sweden, that country ended up with the lowest excess deaths in all of Europe, and yet it's the only country that did not do a lockdown. So again, it does suggest quite obviously to anyone who's, who has an IQ over 50 that lockdowns were not particularly effective and yet were extremely destructive. So look, it's great the Trump administration has put that up finally. And the issue of the lab leak too, I mean, how extraordinary. That was the obvious explanation from the start, right? You had this virus leak in the only city in China where there was a viral institute that actually looked at viruses like that. Like COVID, and yet people were like, "Oh no, it definitely didn't come from the lab."
Not possible.
It goes to show you the power of propaganda. It goes to show you the power of propaganda. The whole mainstream media basically fell in line behind that nonsense.
Absolutely.
And Anthony Fauci, who you mentioned, I mean, he commissioned research which was meant to say that a lab leak was impossible. Of course, now we know that was all propaganda. It was all corruption, and it's so great that's all come out. The sad thing about all this is that a big chunk of the population, have basically lost total respect for so-called experts.
Yeah.
In the health departments, health authorities, scientists have seen how corrupt the whole process can be, and this is a bit scary because if there's actually a serious pandemic next time, and in my view, COVID should not have been considered a serious pandemic, but if there's a real pandemic, then no one's going to believe what we're told.
That's
a
exactly
problem.
Right. Absolutely. Well, we have to look at those countries like Sweden that you mentioned and other states in the US that didn't lock down and had better or the same outcomes. That has to be a lesson or something we can take away for next time, when there is next time, which could be more serious than COVID. But Chief Economist at the IPA, Adam Creighton, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us on Power Hour. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me.